Okay, it's 16:05, so I think we can start. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session focusing on the University of the Arctic and the UArctic chairs and new responses, hopefully, to climate change. So we're very pleased to have the president of UArctic with us here, Lars Gyllerit, who's going to say a few introductory remarks. Are you, Lars? And about the concept of a UArctic chair. Why are there UArctic chairs? And then we will take it in turns. And please.
Thank you, Jan. We have some fantastic people in the Arctic. They have volunteered more or less to be called UArctic chairs and been evaluated and scrutinized carefully. And here they sit, 4 of them. And they are, how many are 12, 14 together? 14 together at the moment, if I remember right. And covering many, many disciplines. Their job is to really generate collaboration in some kind of field which is their expertise between universities all over the Arctic and also outside the Arctic to focus on Arctic issues. And we believe this is a fantastic tool because collaboration is the only way to solve the big problems. And it's much better you guys tell what you do and what you are than that I spend much time on that. But all of them economically is a gift from the home institutions. So that is just made clear, where they get a mandate to work beyond the home institution, but to international collaboration in and around the Arctic. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lars. We're trying to take a lofty view on things here up in this room. So Hanne, would you like to start off, perhaps?
That will be my pleasure. So my name is Hanne Hvidtfeldt Christiansen, and I'm a UArctic chair in physical permafrost processes. And I can add to the nice description you just heard that an Arctic chair is in action for 5 years. And then maybe there would be more chairs coming, so you can all think about what are the needs for this in the future. Maybe some of us would continue for more years. And we spend about 1 day a week working on these issues. So I work with permafrost. And permafrost is quite important in the Arctic because it covers, as I'm sure you all know, about 20 to 25% of the terrestrial parts of planet Earth. And therefore, of course, this is quite important because when we go to the Arctic, it's much higher percentages. Basically, everywhere where there's not glaciers, if you go far enough north, you have permafrost. So for me, it's a great pleasure to be able to work at the international level with permafrost this way. And the actions, what I'm going to take you through is actually the actions that we do internationally with permafrost at the moment. So we collect essential climate variables on permafrost that goes both into research and education. And what I'm addressing today is both research activities but also educational activities. So the definition of permafrost is ground that's frozen for more than 2 years at a time. And therefore, of course, the temperature of the permafrost is pretty important. And at the moment, the international network have around 800 boreholes where temperatures are being collected and put into the global terrestrial network for permafrost. And this is an activity that was specifically designed during the International Polar Year, but this is something that we now need to look after to continue. If you go to the high Arctic, the climatic changes nowadays are highest, where we have something in the order of up to 0.1 degree warming in the permafrost when we have the warmest part of the changing periods. And another parameter that we really look into is the thickness of the active layer, the ground that thaws and freezes on top of the permafrost every year. And this is, of course, what can be active. This is where we can see landsliding associated with it, and this is where the ecologists are quite interested in what is going on. So this is another parameter that is being monitored in more than 100 different sites around the Arctic in a network called CALM, Circumpolar Active Layer Monitoring Program. And there, when you go to Svalbard, where I live, you can see changes of around 0.5 centimeter to 1 centimeter increase in the active layer if you're dealing with sediments. And if you go into bedrock, it would be in the order of maybe 5 to 6 centimeters per year. So those two are kind of basic essential climate variables that we deal with. But then we also have landforms that depends on permafrost, and one of them that maybe not so many of you know are rock glaciers. You all know glaciers, but there are glaciers that consist basically of rock where you cannot see the ice. and it's cemented by permafrost. And they move down slope, and if the temperature goes up, they would speed up. So in the permafrost community, there's actually been identified permafrost rock glacier movement as a new ECV, so essential climate variable that everyone would like to collect data on. So those three are what the scientific community is doing. And then you probably know that in Saint, there's a process going on to develop shared Arctic variables. And permafrost has been identified as one of those that we would really like to focus on. And with the shared Arctic variables, it's about what are the community's needs for permafrost. So I talked about what the scientists have been doing, and then we're also looking into what are the community needs. And of course also scientists work with this, and students, we educate them as well, in looking into parameters that matters for communities, such as how much sloping would we see in permafrost areas, how much greenhouse gas can come out from permafrost areas, how's the infrastructure affected when the permafrost is thawing. And all of these things are probably parameters that may go into these shared Arctic variables. You know, this is a new process, so I'm sure this is where the communities really will have a strong voice in telling us what they would like to see in terms of permafrost being observed for them. And then I would stress also the need for real-time data. So you all are aware, and you all look out the window and you feel the weather. You know what's the air temperature because you check that on your phone in the morning and you dress according to that. What we want to know is also what's the temperature of the permafrost and how quickly is it changing, so that if there's a situation where we need to know more about permafrost, we can actually check it real time. So that's another ambition that is working, that is really going on in many different parts of the permafrost community at the moment. And if I finish up talking a little bit about education, I can say that in the University of the Arctic, we have a thematic network for permafrost, and it has, over the last 10 years, developed summer schools in all parts of the Arctic where we actually focus on bachelor students. A lot of the international collaboration focuses on PhDs, but we need to recruit students that work with permafrost. So these international bachelor summer field schools have been a great success. I have had the pleasure of organizing one together with international colleagues from Japan, Russia, and the US many years ago. And actually we have kind of inherited that at my institution at the University Center in Svalbard and kept that going. So I think the collaboration we have already in UArctic on things like this is really a good thing for the permafrost educational ambitions. And finally, we also have network projects in UArctic, and we recently started such one on trying to see how we can bring working life experience into the education of future permafrost experts. So we are trying to develop an internship platform in which we can actually figure out how we can offer working life experiences to students. This is ambitious because it has to be part of the training of the students as well, and this therefore needs to go into study programs and so on. But this is one of my aims over the next years to start to get this to work, and we have a good head start in the Nordic countries where we now have a project to kick this off. So I'm sure you're going to see more about that. I could probably go on talking about other things, but I will mention two other things in the end where you maybe don't connect it with permafrost, but which is actually an important thing to connect as well, and that is human health. So we now know that there's also effects on humans if we have, for instance, mercury in the ground, if we have anthrax in the ground, and if the permafrost can release that. So of course that's also showing you how interdisciplinary permafrost can be. And you might have heard about another shared variable, which is the wildfires. And they can also be related to permafrost if you get a drying or if you get thawing and you have a longer period where you have permafrost active. So there are many ways why permafrost is important, and I think I've probably spent up my time, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. Thank you, Hanne. Would you like to take questions? Anyone has a burning issue they would like to mention in the room or ask? If not, yes, Stephen? Thank you.
Just a quick one. We've heard in other sessions about the fact that permafrost has to that, and how you think we should fix it, whether UArctic has a role?
You might have to repeat the question.
So I think I was recommended to repeat the question, and the question is about how to get permafrost into Earth system models, and that there is a need for doing so. Yes, we know that, and that is exactly why it's important to have these international databases and to kind of get them to work together with the ESS, so the Earth system models. And over the last 5-10 years, there have been a few projects that have actually managed to do so. This means putting the data into a format like NetCDF, which the modelers can actually use. So there are developments on these things in the permafrost community towards the modeling community as well. And you can, of course, model at big scales, which is what you would like to see, but you can model at much smaller scale where you do not depend on so much data. So I would say we are starting, and we are trying to provide the best data set we can. And the online data might actually also be something that would be useful, because you can make meteorological models where you are depending on data flow. You can't if you can't get a good data flow also from the permafrost.
Thank you, Hanne. Any other questions on that subject? We can return to questions later on if you need time to think about that. So perhaps, David, you'd like to take the floor now?
Right, thank you so much, John. My name is David Anderson. I'm a UArctic chair in the Anthropology of the North, based at the University of Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland. Originally, I come from northern Canada. I've had a long set of travels into the academic career that I occupy right now, and I'm very grateful to the UArctic and to Lars and others for showing some confidence in me in order to ask me to spend 5 years of my time in order to try and make links, draw communities together, and try and show how anthropology can be used in a very positive way in order to help Arctic communities grow and prosper and share their own knowledge with policymakers around the world. My own interest in anthropology started when I was living in Fort McPherson in a Gwich'in community, and many of the community members who taught this Southern Canadian boy how to live in this environment were the ones that pushed me into this particular direction. And I chose to go into an academic career because I believed, as these elders did, that having higher education and access to the resources of a university allows us to build bridges, to conduct what we often call scientific diplomacy, of using knowledge in a creative way in order to join people together. So in the project that I have for a UArctic circumpolar anthropology, I would like to redesign circumpolar anthropology in such a way that it is humble, that it listens, and that it contributes to the challenges such as climate change that I'll be speaking about today, but also the understanding of the variety of communities that are throughout the Arctic. I'm going to illustrate this in 3 different ways, using the concepts of survivance, of sustainability, and finally of green colonialism. Survivance is a concept that a First Nations literary scholar has put forward to describe the way that many First Nations people are able to actively adapt to situations, but also constructively adapt to legacies of great oppression and great harm. But it talks about a certain type of active and non-victimhood that these communities have. And what I very much like about this particular idea of survivance is that it's often based in humor. It's based in reaching out in order to try and bring in new ideas. And I had several examples of survivance that I've taken from the conversations that I've had with coastal Sami in northern Norway and with Evenki and Nenets in Siberia. But I heard of many here at this venue, and I wanted to repeat what I've heard just in the last couple of days. I was very impressed with many of the presentations done by the Indigenous Environmental Network at several of the panels here. And they spoke about not only the need to preserve their traditional foods and their own ways of life, but also to respect their own intuition about how to change their cultures in order to create more autonomy and better health and better health outcomes for their communities. In particular, I was impressed by a presentation by a Sami woman from northern Norway who spoke about the tragedy of the fact that their own fjords have been emptied of fish and the kelp that protects the fish, and also sort of covered over with this encroachment of Kamchatka crab coming into the fjords, but the state actors won't allow them to harvest the crabs, more than a dozen, I guess, per person, in order to feed their families, and they on the grounds that it's not a traditional food. So the purpose of a circumpolar UArctic anthropology would be to try and explain that people are not locked into traditions, that there are ways of using the skills and the intuition of living in an Arctic environment to do different things, whether that be small-scale mining or harvesting Kamchatka crab or other types of participation that would make these particular environments livable. In terms of resilience and sustainability, there's a great discussion on the degree to which these terms are locally grounded or not. I'm guided again by some work done by First Nations legal scholars who talk about the need for sustainability to be rooted in local worldviews. Here I'm quite interested in the way that, and a lot of the work that I've done has been documenting the way that people use local resources for healing, local resources for building healthy communities, and how this model of using resources that are at hand, both spiritual resources and food resources, is probably a model that we could use in order to survive the ecological crises that face us. So this idea of sustainability that's rooted in the local environment is not one that is confined to indigenous Arctic peoples, but it's one that all peoples can adapt to and use in order to redesign cities and urban areas in such a way that they can be rooted in their own landscape and use the resources that they have to hand. The final concept, which has been talked about in great detail at this event and in some of the sessions that I've attended, is that of green colonialism. And this is, I think, is the real challenge and should be one of the guiding concepts of this entire meeting. The meeting has been guided by the idea that we have to find a way in order to stop climate change. We have to use geoengineering perhaps to change the rate of the Earth's heating, that we have to find ways of adopting new technologies. But we also have to understand how very siloed conversations and decisions are often replicating the type of logic that created the environmental crisis that we have right now. So again, I'm guided by many indigenous Arctic communities that point to the fact that often in the past 200 years, people have come for their resources, be they whale oil or petroleum under the ice. Now they're coming for the wide open expanses that offer a place to set up wind turbines and places where they can mine rare earth metals, and that all of these metals and power sources are used in order to make southern cities much more sustainable, and that is unfair and unjust, and that there must be a way of balancing the energy transition in a way that respects and learns from these particular communities. So although anthropology often has a negative reputation in many indigenous communities, I would like to point to the positives. The people who taught me when I was going into my formal education felt that there's a way that knowledge and technology can be used to solve problems. And I believe that this particular opportunity that the UArctic has given us for us to share our knowledge internationally at fora such as this will be a good opportunity for knowledge to expand, for science diplomacy to work in order to share the ideas that we have in order to build a better future for both settler and indigenous peoples within the Arctic.
Okay, thank you, David. Any reactions to that? Any questions? We're all impressed, and I think you gave the cue to Melody because of science diplomacy.
Well, yes, I was set up quite well, thank you. We did not practice that. So I am Melody Brown-Burkins. I am the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth, and I am the UArctic Chair in Science Diplomacy and Inclusion. So I'm going to follow very closely to your remarks. In thinking, though, I'm going to step back and say that one of the pieces that I've been looking at, I used to study in the field. I worked in Antarctica, I've worked in the Arctic as a stable isotope biogeochemist. You should not let me in a lab anymore. I did move into policy and governance administration. And really, I try to think about all of the aspects that were just discussed, actually, on issues of rock glaciers and on issues of gaps in knowledge, on issues of how we behave and interact in our pursuit of scholarship as well as policy, is underpinned by systems that incentivize them in certain ways. And so when I think about science diplomacy and inclusion, I'm trying to think about all of those systems of science and policy and international affairs and how we work in the real world, and how those systems actually can either be harmful or beneficial. And exactly the point that was just made, we've gotten ourselves into this process through a certain way of how our systems and our institutions have been created. How do we look at them, reflect upon them, review them, perhaps learn from others of how we should change them, and become better scientists, better policymakers, and better science diplomats. So in general, just so you know, I actually grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska, so I have an Arctic soul, and I'm now on the east coast of the United States. But the form of to recap what that thinking of inclusive science diplomacy is to me, is that we're looking for solutions. All of us, I believe, in the Arctic are looking for solutions that are inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. But we cannot, I would posit that you cannot find solutions that are inclusive, equitable, and sustainable if you are not using knowledge systems that are also more inclusive, more equitable, and more sustainable. And that does take a system change, an approach change. And we have to be willing to think about that and look at our institutions of governance and higher education and find those ways to change them. And that's what I do in my role. I sit on boards, I go to many meetings, I connect people who have my hope, the power, the influence, and the thought leadership to take these ideas and really change some of our systems for the better, to include more indigenous knowledge, more diverse knowledge systems from around the world. That it's not just the right thing to do, it actually makes our science more impactful, more sustainable, and far, far better. We do know this. There's peer-reviewed research telling us this, that participatory research, that research co-produced with communities, that returned to communities so that there's buy-in, actually has lasting impact. So we need to do that, but our institutions aren't necessarily set up for it. So I like to find those, we can call them knowledge gaps. Where are the knowledge gaps in our systems, in our institutions, and where the incentives are not aligned to us doing what we should be doing to get the better, more inclusive, more sustainable, more equitable knowledge into our solutions for the future. And the solutions are pressing, we need them right now. We needed them 20 years ago, and now we're facing issues of climate change happening around us. My concern, will we address them because we don't have those tools built in our current institutions? How do we put that on speed dial? How do we try to make those changes so we don't repeat the same colonialism, the disregard of indigenous communities, the disregard of all communities and their interests as we try to study our way and maybe fix these issues that are in front of us. So that is what calls me to being a UArctic chair. I did say when I applied to be it, I wanted to do three things, and I'll say, and I'm very excited to do them because they do connect the resources of UArctic, and that is why we are UArctic chairs. The first one was to start a program of students at my institution, but I hope to get some more as well, but students who are thinking about the future of the Arctic in this more inclusive way, thinking about international affairs, thinking about science, thinking about the arts, putting it all together and working around all of the thematic networks of UArctic. How can I pair them with these scholars, both indigenous and non-indigenous, in the UArctic network? So we've just launched that. The second thing is how do I, with the UArctic chair hat, bring in more underrepresented fellows, knowledge holders, not just PhDs, and support them and support that network in some way. And so I'm trying to do that with some early investments and trying to let that network build a network. And that, again, is something that UArctic is doing already, modeling, but how can I amplify that and work with the UArctic resources and network to make that a positive future. And last, I gave a stretch goal to myself is, on this journey of trying to do this work, I know I'm going to make many mistakes, and I'm going to step in places which I'm still learning how to do this, and so how do I capture that? And I've been thinking of book, a podcast. I'm not quite sure how to do it. That's my third stretch goal, and if people have ideas, but it is the idea that we actually are trying a massive change. And one of the goals I will say that is, you'll hear tomorrow if you go to something, there's going to be a talk on something called ICARP. It's a terrible name. It's the 4th International Conference on Arctic Research Planning. It sets the decadal goals for the globe, for the world, on Arctic research. In the ICARP 3, 10 years ago, they said we should have more knowledge, diverse knowledge systems in academic research, in Arctic research. We should be more holistic. And they said that, and they wanted to do it, and now it's almost 10 years later. In 2 years, we'll have the 4th International Conference. But we want to now implement that. We want to work, and we're having very, very kind Indigenous leaders saying, yes, we think this is important too. Let's make that truly happen. We need more Indigenous leaders in the ICARP process. So we're right now putting out invitations and saying this could shift how we think about the future of Arctic research. This is a moment in time. Will you join and help us design this? We don't want to design it without your leadership. So that is something we're trying to do right now. And we've called it indigenizing Arctic research, but you can call it more knowledge diversity. So there are both the big ideas of the approaches and then real tools that are happening right now in international Arctic science diplomacy that I think are huge tools and levers that I hope UArctic and these UArctic chairs, I'm capturing them all, to be part of that and really make this change. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Any questions or reactions to that? Yes, please.
How can we use these tools to connect with Russia and solve it?
Oh, thank you for that question.
The question was about how we can connect all those tools
My
with
science diplomacy skills.
Russia and.
So luckily, I was yeah. I was just in this conversation with the U.S. Arctic strategy just came up, and the challenge, and UArctic has managed this really carefully, and I sit on the International Science Council, has also been managed very thoughtfully. We have incredible colleagues in Russia, and we all are very sad that we are on pause. And government to government right now, those relationships are not going to move forward. There are places where, if it's allowed by certain governments, scientists can continue to collaborate. The concern is, of course, whether it's safe for everyone to do so. But I think we're all trying to be thoughtful about it and know that this is a government issue, and we do need, scientists have always collaborated, and they've been part of that communication we need. We are in a very challenging time, at least right now. So we think about it a lot. I don't think it will solve. I think we have to have a lot of folks and a lot of ideas coming forward. I did want to say one quick thing is and one of my colleagues here is working on the future of ethical research in Greenland, and you may know that when I say I shouldn't say this roadmap is not out there. The Inuit people, the Sami people, the Greenlandic government are all telling us what is the approach to this the inclusive, equitable, sustainable research protocols. And we did this morning in a small breakout session, we talked about, I thought of listening to everyone, the 5 real principles for the future of Arctic research are to prioritize listening, prioritize human rights, prioritize paths to self-determination, prioritize diverse ways of knowing, and prioritize knowledge reciprocity, making sure knowledge gets back to the communities in which it was given. I just pivoted from your Russia question, but but if anyone else has one, and if my other colleagues want to speak to it, I'm very sad, and I hope we can get back to our partnerships.
I think there was another question at the back. Yes, please.
Oh, hello.
Hi. So I'm listening to your presentation, fascinating. As you know, this is married, I want to develop some skills as well. But I'm wondering whether engaging the Arctic Council's permanent participants
Yes.
where to best engage their constituency will be a golden avenue, but infrastructure already exists, it's already mobilized, and it seems to be a natural pathway. Is that something that you might want to comment on? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. The question, if folks didn't hear it, are we using, for knowledge gaps, are we working with the Arctic Council's permanent participants? Absolutely, yes. In fact, the one of the former ICC chair, who was at the Dr. Daly Sambodoro, she worked with over 180,000 Inuit for over 6 or 7 years, I believe, and they came out with the Inuit ethical and equitable and meaningful engagement protocols. So those groups have told us how to do better, and in fact, when I mentioned Indigenous leaders who are helping us to reach out to other Indigenous leaders on this work, it is they are the permanent participants engagement and beyond. So it's a wonderful network that we have to continue to work with, and what we need to listen to and learn from. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Melody. So it's my turn, I suppose. Thank you. My name is Jan Borm. I'm a professor of English literature at the University of Versailles, Saint-Quentin-en, Yvelines, associate member of the University of Paris-Saclay, which is the biggest French research consortium now, representing 13% of research in France, with a very strong, a lot of colleagues work in environment science, climate change related research, and the Arctic. Valérie Masson-Delmotte was here earlier today. He was one of our most distinguished guests. I want to start off by saying I love UArctic. It's an absolutely fantastic organization. It's like a big family. It's absolutely wonderful to be here and to see members of the UArctic regularly. And thank you for having offered us this opportunity to be UArctic chairs. That is another thing I love. We have distinguished UArctic chairs here in the room, 2 colleagues from Monaco-UVSQ notably. And it's just great to think there are 14, 15 people, and I can reach out to them very easily, and we can try to get things going. We'll see if we manage, but let's try. So this panel was a kind of act of usurpation. When we were meeting for the first time in St. Andrews, we said, why don't we do a panel? And then, you don't always get the chance to talk to everyone, and you never have enough time, so we said, let's just do it. And so it's kind of ad hoc decision, and I hope there will be more, and I hope our colleagues will take over, and we take it in turns. So I'm used to being usually the odd one out, because I'm from a non-Arctic country. I'm not French. I'm German by origin. I teach English literature in France, and I represent the human science, which is the one that is usually not very much present in discussions of this kind here. We get a lot of natural science, we get a lot of social science, we have very powerful natural science organizations, we have a very powerful social science organization which says it's very open to human science, but it is called International Social Science. What can you do? So the human science, history, culture, literature, philosophy, are the subjects that are not so often taken into consideration. So I have 2 anecdotes concerning my first 2 early experiences in the Arctic. Going to Greenland for the first time about 10 years ago. First question from people there, why are we coming here? And the second question was, are you coming again? And exactly the same thing in Siberia. Well, what are you doing here? This is a long time ago. And are you coming back? And when I said, well, yes, that's the whole point. Okay, so I saw the look was adjusted, all right? Because people are fed up of people just passing through. And in the panel that Melody alluded to, ethics in Greenland, we heard today that we have, similar to over-tourism, a situation of over-researching Greenland. It reminds me of a famous case study in France. In the 1960s, in Brittany, it was decided by the French National Research Agency to have a whole crowd of researchers descend on a village in Brittany to investigate this village. And suddenly you had all these very distinguished university professors asking people questions left, right, and center. And nothing much came out of it other than huge and lengthy reports that nobody was reading. And then the person whose name was chosen for our institute at the University of Versailles Saint-Quentin, the Institute of Arctic Research, Jean Malaurie, Monaco-UVSQ. Jean Malaurie is a patriarch of French Arctic studies, turning 100 in December and publishing a book in a couple of weeks' time. So Malaurie founded a famous book series called Terre Humaine. It's a legendary book series in France of life stories and testimonies. And in that series, he published a book by a Breton storyteller called Père Jacques Elias. It was just simply telling the stories he heard as a young person in his own family. And the book sold 1 million copies in France. It was an absolute cultural phenomenon of cultural revival, because a lot of people had been looking down on rural French cultures, especially Breton culture, which is not francophone, but speaking a Celtic language. And suddenly people said, we're allowed to talk about our culture again. It's not embarrassing to speak in Paris of our roots. And no. So I think this illustrates his own itinerary and the importance of taking into consideration cultural perspectives. So there is a cultural perception of climate change, and we need to take that into consideration. We've heard very distinguished speakers here, the Governor General of Canada talking about the history of relations between people in the Arctic and people coming from outside the Arctic, and she said we have to just sit down and talk, whether things were good or bad, but we just have to find a way of sitting down and talking about that. And we've had very powerful voices in the Arctic talking about the Arctic point of view about climate change, and that famous autobiography called The Right to be Cold. That's a really catchy slogan, you know. So why is the world taking away your habitat that you've been used to forever? And so another statement I heard earlier today from the governor of the Northwestern Territories was that we have a lot of perspectives to share about climate change, you know. So I think I see my action here as the Arctic Chair in Arctic Humanities somewhere in between. We have an Arctic Studies program at our university which is interdisciplinary with environment science and human and social science. It was not easy to set up, but we reached a kind of compromise, so it can be done between the scientists and the researchers. We said, you must find a pitch so that everybody can understand what you're saying. And so that meant taking out a lot of graphs and a lot of abbreviations and what have you, you know, and same thing for the human and social science to learn to keep it short to the point. So, you know, it took some time, but it has been working, and there are students here from the program who could talk about that. So this is a similar challenge we have inside our group here, I think, and I think we can create new initiatives. So from the cultural side, we have a number of colleagues working together in Iceland, Faroe Islands, Canada, France, and other places. We wish to create a new thematic network on on culture and history in the Arctic, and we hope UArctic will accommodate for this new thematic network. It's obviously overlapping with another network on archives and other initiatives, the art initiative inside. But I think we want to insist on the fact that there's always a historical side to things, that any place you go, anywhere, notably in the Arctic, is likely to be full of different layers of history, what we call in French épaisseur du lieu. So there are many stories to one place, and so you go somewhere, but people there, they have been living with that for a long time, and you come with your plans, but you know, how does that fit into the agenda of the people there? So we're hoping to initiate new initiatives in that way. So we have about 15 minutes now to discuss with all of you and just share our views on what could be done, should be done. Any reactions? Any questions? We have also one chair here in education issues, so there's been a lot of talk about education, and we had a really interesting comment this morning from a person working in the ministry in Greenland, and she said, okay, we need scientists when they come to us to explain what they're doing, but don't tell them don't tell our people it's all on the website. And don't make written statements, because our people come from oral cultures, and even though we know how to read and write, it's not the thing we do very easily. So please find new ways of communicating what you have to say. So she said, for instance, why don't you just do a video or something? And then don't assume that the whole world speaks fluent English. So we need to think also about the translation issue, to provide this in the languages, so that costs more money. So please, when we're applying for funds, we need to think about that, even though that's annoying because it stops us from buying another machine. But it's important. And then perhaps one last point, maybe Kirk, you would like to say something about that. There was also talk about the educational material that we can provide in the way of outreach, and that needs to also strive for cultural relevance. So I remember having shown one of those flyers from our university to students coming to our university, from one student from Greenland, and I showed it to her in Greenland, and she said, "This is not for me." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, there's no Greenlander on the photographs." I said, "It's for other guys, all right?" And it wouldn't have occurred to me like that spontaneously, but I got the point, right? People need to feel related, concerned by things. So we need to change our mindset about that also. Stephen, please, yes.
Thank you, all of you. And I guess a question for the whole panel. I'm impressed by, as you know, I'm impressed by the work done by the UArctic and the chairs. I think that's fantastic development. But as chairs, you got together spontaneously and said, let's sit down and talk. And you chose a title of the UArctic's response to, I'll just read the title. I think it says, UArctic Responses to Climate Change.
Yeah.
And we've heard some of the responses to climate change, but at the same time we're hearing that it's a pressing issue, to put it mildly in English, I suppose. Are we doing enough? If you could do more, if the panel could do more, what would it be in our response to stereotyping?
So I will say yes. I think what I've seen wonderfully is this entire building of folks. There are a few maybe in a different space, but very few. And all of UArctic has adopted. What I loved about UArctic early on was that it was a group of researchers and educators around the circumpolar north who put the Paris Climate Agreement in a declaration. I'd never seen any institution of research and education talk about the Paris Climate Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and co-production of knowledge, things that were actually making statements on the values of how we approach these issues. I think what we were alluding to, at least I think here, was that climate change is a pressing issue that everyone has to be thinking about their own area of research and the elevation that UArctic has given us with these chairs of what change might I be able to make, and how can I work with the UArctic resources to do so. But each person may not be just in a specific knowledge gap of the technical science. We may be trying, as you heard from mine, we may be actually also trying to look at from different lenses and bring that. We can't do it at this panel, but we were talking about a next meeting, actually, looking at the future of Arctic climate and cooperation and how it informs policy, saying that how this UArctic chair group could come together on climate change or on all these pressing issues is really, we need to know some of the policy questions, potentially, that are out there that we could answer and focus. So this is more general, this is how we're all bringing ideas that fit into the pressing issue that is climate change. It's through people, it's through systems, it's through an understanding of specific projects and specific science. But we have not yet had the chance to really focus, and I think it really is on a critical policy issue where we can inform from our different spaces and truly turn the dial. We do need to come together in that kind of way. So this was spontaneous. Let's see what we can do. But as you're hearing, we don't have that kind of focus just yet. And I don't know if that's something that's something we will do. It could be a use of UArctic chairs, but it wouldn't just be us. Obviously, it would be bringing in all of our networks and really trying to look at a problem. But again, you're hearing that I would love to see not only the data point or what, how do we get away from a tipping point, but how do we actually look at how all of the kinds of things that UArctic exemplifies, this coming together of knowledge, this looking at risks and advances from so many perspectives. We don't do it again. So I'm hoping we do both. I'm hoping we have this expertise, start looking at those knowledge gaps in permafrost and in modeling, and we have folks in security, and we have folks in pollution, and we have amazing UArctic chairs. And each of us also thinks about how we change the future for our PhD students and our undergraduates, and folks thinking about going into government and policy, and thinking about, again, a much more a different approach to all of these global challenges, so that we can have a much more peaceful and sustainable world, rather than continuing this challenge we've created.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, for a very challenging question.
Yeah.
First response might be also to say you can always do more, and you should do, perhaps. So I think we can use our position as cultural mediators and bridging gaps. And there was a really moving session in the general session downstairs now of young people from the Canadian North, talking about the terrible problems they have there, the suicide. It was absolutely moving, and I saw one of them afterwards outside. I wanted to say to her, "How can I help? You know, and how can we help?" All right. So I think we could function as intermediaries and promote.
I think we also take different roles, so that UArctic is represented in many different ways, where we may not think so much about UArctic naturally. So I think that's an advantage that comes from us being, but also us being together, so that we know, okay, Jan would maybe do this and so on. So I think you will see that the institution as such will get more visible in different fora. That's our job.
And the one last, but I will also say, if we as scientists, as researchers, as scholars, also start modeling some of those, and I think we all have done it because we've talked with one another, but when we work in the Arctic, we listen, we think about diverse knowledge systems and appreciate that learning, and we think about the human rights and the self-determination of the folks in that we don't just go in and study and come back. Just doing those things too is actually, that is how climate change will be solved. It will be us all together. This is a terrible thing I'm about to say. I believe in science deeply. I do think we may have done most of the science we need to actually mitigate climate change. A lot of it has been done. What we need now is a lot of science for how we adapt, but we need to synthesize with the communities a lot of the research that has been done and make it happen. We know what the roadmaps are to mitigate climate change. It's more of we all know it's a bit of a social and political issue now. So that's where I'm mostly thinking we have to continue studying, but we have to study in partnership with people in the Arctic and around the world, more than we have before. And then we have to start addressing adaptation and being more thoughtful about how our research impacts those who, and serves them, but also impacts them.
Okay, any other questions or reactions? We still have a few minutes. Everyone's enjoying the view and contemplating. We're not well. Yes, please.
If the UArctic chairs were given $20 million to do something about climate change, what would you do together? What would you do?
Yeah.
I can roll out my project.
We would probably organize very quickly a get-together and figure out how to react, because we would have different opinions on this, as you just heard, and we would need to talk together and agree on what to do together. And then you can act at different levels. You can act at the local level, and you can do that in different places. That could be one version, but you could also try to act together at a higher level, which would take even more discussions. So I'm sure this is possible because we know each other and have built that trust in understanding what's going on. This is a process that's going on now. So if you ask this question next year, there would be even more answers to that and possibilities identified, I think, but I don't know what you think.
Well, we did actually have a UArctic chair meeting, pre-meeting before this meeting, and we hashed out a lot of interesting scenarios. We talked a lot about expressing the frustration with the current model of the way that research finance works, and that it prevents us from offering solutions to community-driven climate change mitigation. So one good way of using that $20 million would be finding ways of ensuring that scientific solutions are community-based and are grounded within community interests. That would be probably the proper level of using that relatively, I know it sounds like a big number, but relatively small amount of money to have a global solution. Several of us sitting around the table, but it wasn't all 14 of us, had also shown a lot of interest in food sovereignty, of looking at how ensuring good nutrition and local access to food and clean water would actually tie together a lot of our expertise in monitoring pollution and studying permafrost and studying how to mix different knowledge traditions together. And so we were throwing out ideas of some frames that could actually incorporate a lot of the expertise that we bring. So I'm sure that we would come up with a very nice statement for how to spend that money, but thank you for the invitation.
Do you want to go first?
Oh, no, please.
So I will reiterate that actually I think that I would hope that the UArctic chairs would come and use the UArctic name and global network to convene all of those who have brought solutions together that are already on the table and find the top, those that we could implement immediately. What were almost a triage? But I would not say the UArctic chairs necessarily would have the expertise, but we would have working with UArctic and its network, we could elevate from our institutions, from our voices, make this event happen, bring in the knowledge that has been gathered, and then help to find a process to what can we do in the first 5 years, in the next 5 years, because those solutions are out there, and the UArctic network is vast, and we have not had the funds to go and quickly maybe work with the Secretariat, brings people to get that knowledge and synthesize it, and really figure out with NGOs, with policy partners, with industry partners, a massive moonshot, as they call it. What should we do first? What should we do second? What should we do third? So it really wouldn't be about us, but I think the UArctic chairs could use their voices and the network of UArctic. I'm looking at Lars and Oti because I don't need to speak for them. but if UArctic is beautifully positioned to do something like this. It has an incredible network that has been built over decades with indigenous and non-indigenous peoples of the Arctic, with industry, with policymakers, with governments, with NGOs. What better group to invest in, to think about the solutions already on the table that are not happening, and that to help prioritize those with others for the future.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Sigrid, and I work within Arctic humanities from the standpoint of theology and religious studies. And I appreciate the work that you are doing, and I was especially happy to hear about the importance that you put on indigenous knowledges being at the heart of UArctic. So my question is, are there chairs at the University of Arctic that have an indigenous background? Not only Western people working with ideas from indigenous people. Thank you.
Okay, I think we need to turn to our president for that. And you can maybe wrap up then.
Maybe that too. A very important question. If the world were perfect, we would have many indigenous chairs here. The world isn't perfect. What we do have in UArctic, there was nominated, for example, together with this court of chairs, a few UArctic chairs. We do also have in the Science Advisory Board of UArctic, called Mimir, led by Arya, sitting there. There is indigenous professors there on the level with the chairs. So that is represented there. Among the chairs here, the problem occurred that we couldn't use Western scientists to decide whether a indigenous person's knowledge were good enough to be a chair or not. That evaluation shouldn't happen by these people. It should happen by the people from the communities. That is the logic. Now we turn to our indigenous universities and colleges in UArctic and asked them, can you help us make that happen? And they were not sure if they would be able to. So we started a process to actually figure out how to do it, led by indigenous peoples. And we need to let the indigenous peoples themselves decide what is the mechanism on how to evaluate if a person has right kind of knowledge or right quality of knowledge. And we are then talking about knowledge based on indigenous merits, not on Western science merits. We do also have seek for funding, so we are able to have externally funded indigenous chairs because they are not always coming from a rich university who can sponsor them. So that is in process, and we believe we will have funding for such chairs very soon. So we hope that can go fast. Those who are very interested in the method, the closest we have come is something called WINHEC, the World Indigenous Higher Education Consortium. Is a very fantastic organization who provides a way to produce an indigenous scholarness kind of evaluation system, and it's probably the path it will take if you are into that. But unfortunately it takes time to get there, and that's sad for us. We would have loved to be there now. So that is an answer to that question. Those of you at chairs in the room, raise up or wave your arm or something so people can see who you are. So there's not only these four if you want to talk further. Bottom line is the energy in the group of UArctic chairs is fantastic. The energy we have in this Mimir group of extremely well grown up people with an academic background, they are almost all pensioners who were the first cohort to actually quality check if these were good enough, is also fantastic. We are very fortunate in UArctic because you're supported by so many good brains who want well for the Arctic and its peoples. And I think they also come to it with the right kind of heart, as you have probably witnessed it now. And I think that make it possible to have a hope that the future of the world will not necessarily be a total climate catastrophe, but will be a equitable, fair world where it is possible to solve many of the big problems together. Thank you for working with us.
Thank you, Lars, and thank you all for coming.